I am Ronan Daglish, and this is my project on genocide. I have researched two terrible events in the 20th century, the Holocaust during World War II and the Armenian Genocide, which happened during World War I. First, we should understand what genocide is. The United Nations defines it as an internationally recognized crime where acts were committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, or religious group. It comes from the root word geno, which means race or tribe, and cide, which means to kill or murder. So a genocide is an attempt to kill an entire tribe or race of people. The Holocaust was one of the worst genocides in human history. Nazi Germany took Jewish people from their homes and put them into concentration camps. They were killed by poison gas or starved and worked to death. Their bodies were destroyed in giant incinerators. Over 6 million Jews were killed, as well as many other victims. The Holocaust began right after Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party took control of Germany in 1933. In May of that year, the first concentration camp was opened at Dachau. The deportations continued until Allied soldiers invaded Germany and liberated the camps in 1945. In the beginning, the Nazis took away legal rights for all Jews. Then they removed them from their homes and put them into isolated communities called ghettos, in what Nazis called the final solution to the Jewish problem. Millions were transported to concentration camps in Germany and all over the parts of Europe Germany had captured. There were more than 44,000 camps and detention centers across Nazi-occupied Europe. The victims of the Holocaust were mostly the Jewish people of Europe. Over 2/3 of Europe's Jews were killed, and many of the survivors left Europe after the war to live in North America or the new state of Israel. Other victims of the Holocaust included political enemies of the Nazis, Roma, homosexuals, and the disabled. Even those who survived had their families torn apart and their lives destroyed. In a cruel irony, many survivors of the concentration camps in Eastern Europe were freed from Nazi dictatorship only to live under the totalitarianism of communism for the next 45 years. It is hard to explain why the Holocaust happened. The most important reason was a hatred of the Jews, which we call anti-Semitism. They were hated for not being Christian and because they had a different culture from other Europeans. But it is important to say that the Nazis didn't create anti-Semitism. For over 1,000 years, Europeans had been taught to hate and mistrust Jews. Violence and mass killings of Jews had been happening for centuries. The Nazis took advantage of this existing hatred and carried it to a new, terrifying extreme. The Nazis used the Jews as a scapegoat or someone to blame for all the problems in Germany. The Jews were resented because they had a lot of wealth and political influence in Germany. The Nazis blamed them for all the suffering of World War I. The Nazis used hatred of the Jews to rally Germans around the Nazi leadership. Unfortunately, the Holocaust wasn't the first genocide in history. It wasn't even the first genocide of the 20th century. Just like the Germans tried to wipe out the Jewish population of Europe, the Turks tried 20 years earlier to destroy the Armenian community in the Ottoman Empire. The two genocides were similar in many ways, but they both have differences too. The Armenian genocide had fewer victims than the Holocaust, but many of the lessons we can learn from them are the same. By studying them, we can learn what genocides have in common and how to stop them from happening again. The Armenians were a small minority inside the Ottoman Empire, which is also called Turkey. There were a little over 2 million Armenians living in eastern Turkey. A huge number of Armenians were killed, and most of the survivors were forced out of the country as refugees. Even 100 years later, the government of Turkey denies that the genocide happened. The Armenian genocide happened just over 100 years ago at the same time as World War I. It began in 1914 and ended around 1918. The Ottoman Empire covered what we call Turkey today and spread across the eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. The Armenians lived in a territory in eastern Turkey, but 90% of this land was taken away from them during the genocide. Unlike the Holocaust, where the Jews were taken from their homes and sent into concentration camps, the Armenians were killed where they lived. Ottoman soldiers went from village to village and carried out massacres of the Armenian population. The Armenians were sometimes marched over long distances just to kill them by starvation and exhaustion. There were several reasons the Turks wanted to wipe out the Armenian population. Like the Jews in Europe, there was a long history of victimizing and killing communities of Armenians inside the Ottoman Empire. So the Turkish people had already learned to hate the Armenians, and they had come to accept violence against them. The Armenians suffered prejudice and oppression because they were Christians, and the Ottomans were Muslims. Christians had fewer rights, paid special taxes, and were considered infidels, which means outsiders. Because the Armenians were cultural connections with Russia, they were seen as disloyal to the Central Powers in World War I. They were suspected of wanting the Allies to win the war. Finally, there was a jealousy and resentment against the Armenians because they were generally better educated and more wealthy than the Turks. Like the Jews in Europe, people believed those advantages needed to be taken away. I interviewed my Uncle Larry, who is Armenian. Many members of his family were killed during the genocide. Uncle Larry's father was the last surviving member of his family. He escaped as a little boy. Larry's grandfather distracted the soldiers and let himself be killed so Larry's father could escape and survive. When his grandmother was just a little girl, she was taken away from her mother. She tore a piece of her mother's dress when the soldiers took her away to be killed. She kept that scrap of cloth in her Bible and prayed over it for the rest of her life. It was the only thing she had left of her mother. She hid from the soldiers with a few others. They survived by stealing the scraps of food the soldiers left out for their dogs. Uncle Larry's family owned a flour mill in their village. It still exists today, but it is owned by a Turkish family. So much of the land and wealth that was taken away from the Armenians was given to the Turks. Uncle Larry says that the genocide shows how brutal and cruel people can be, but it also shows our incredible ability to be resilient. The refugees formed new Armenian communities all over the world. They built new lives, and they are generally very prosperous. Some of them even found their lost families. Uncle Larry's mother thought she had lost every member of her family until she found her brother 10 years after the genocide. So how are these two genocides different from each other? The Holocaust killed a lot more people, even though both the Jews and Armenians lost about 2/3 of their population. The Holocaust brought the Jewish population together in concentration camps for mass murder, but the Turks killed Armenians village by village. One of the most important differences is that Germans have accepted their responsibility for the Holocaust, and they teach their children to never allow anything like that to happen again. But in Turkey, they still deny it ever happened. The Jews and Armenians were hated because of their religion and their culture. Both groups were educated and successful, which made people jealous. The genocides were a way for others to steal their wealth. The genocides did not happen overnight. People accepted it because they had been taught to hate and got used to violence against those people over many generations. Both genocides killed huge numbers of people and made most of the others into refugees. Very few were left behind afterwards. The most important thing they have in common is that the victims were treated like they were not human. Somehow, people were able to do horrible things to a whole community of people without remorse. The Holocaust may be the worst genocide in history, but it is definitely not the only one. Genocides happen when nobody is watching and nobody speaks up to stop them. People are more comfortable doing evil things when they can hide what they're doing. There are graves and Holocaust monuments all over the world with the words "never again" on them. If we remember the Holocaust, we may be able to stop it from ever happening again. To be honest, I hated learning about the genocide. I hated learning about all those sad stories and thinking about how cruel and evil people have been to each other. But I'm glad that I talked with my Uncle Larry about this assignment. He told me that even though people can destroy and kill, the most important lesson is that people have the ability to come back from anything. I think about my Uncle Larry's family who were killed and the ones who fought so hard to survive. I think they would be relieved to see that the genocide was not the end of their family's story. Today, my Uncle Larry lives safe in a free country and has a very happy life. He became a soldier and a lawyer, which means he spends his life protecting the freedom of other people. I think his family would be proud of him, and it makes me happy to know that their very sad story ends with so much hope. All victims of genocide should be remembered, and we should all say, "never again."